morning. I am Professor Pena, and this is Modes of Development. Let me share my screen. What are modes of development? They are ways of structuring a paragraph or essay, and structuring the paragraph or essay depends on the content. So modes of development depend on the content. And yet, they follow common conventions. Modes of development follow common conventions. Familiarity with them helps in reading and understanding, particularly because it aids the reader in what to expect. So, this morning, we'll just discuss a few modes of development, particularly illustration, definition, classification, comparison and contrast, and argumentation. Let's start with illustration. An illustration mode of development makes use of examples to elaborate main ideas. Let's talk about writing using the illustration mode of development. Let's first discuss the sentence of an illustration. So if you use a mode of development, it follows that the essay becomes clear. So if you use an illustration mode of development, then you have an illustration essay. The thesis sentence of an illustration mode of development explains a concept or idea in the form of a summary of its details. Let's have an example topic. What is insider trading? Okay. We have a sample thesis for this kind of essay. This is a sample thesis. Insider trading refers to the practice of purchasing or selling publicly traded company securities while in possession of material information that is not yet public information. Insider trading refers to the practice of purchasing or selling publicly traded company securities while in possession of material or relevant information that is not yet public information. By the way, when you hear the word material, particularly in legal jargon, it's a fancy way of saying relevant. Okay. So let's discuss the introduction part. The introductory paragraph of an illustration of development contains background information and a thesis sentence. Okay, we have a sample paragraph of an illustration essay. We have the thesis sentence. Insider trading refers to the practice of purchasing or selling a publicly traded company securities while in possession of material information that is not yet public information. So here's a little bit of background as part of the introduction. Material information refers to any and all information that may result in a substantial impact on the decision of an investor regarding whether to buy or sell the security. So that was the introduction. We now have the body. The body is composed of several paragraphs that contain topic sentences that elaborate or explain further the thesis sentence. Those topic sentences are in turn elaborated or supported by examples that illustrate the main ideas. So when it comes to illustration, the keyword is examples. So let's have an example of examples. Elaboration in an illustration essay. Here's one example that will illustrate the thesis sentence, the idea expressed in the thesis sentence. The CEO of a company divulges important information about the acquisition of his company to a friend who owns holds a substantial shareholding in the company. The friend acts upon the information and sells all his shares before the information is made public. That's one example of insider trading. Here's another example. A government employee acts upon his knowledge about a new regulation to be passed which will benefit a sugar exporting firm and buys its shares before the regulation becomes public knowledge. Here's a third example. A high-level employee overhears some conversation about a merger and understands its market impact and consequently buys the shares of the company in his father's account. Take note, somebody just overhears the information, and based on that, you buy stocks. That's already considered insider trading. So, because of those examples, you are able to understand the concept of insider trading, something that's probably not very familiar to many of us. Because of the illustration essay, and through the examples in the illustration essay, we are able to understand the concept of insider trading through the examples. Okay, for the conclusion part, it simply includes a restatement of the thesis segments for the main ideas. Okay, so we have the introduction of the conclusion. That's for illustration. The keyword is examples. Let's now talk about definition. Definition paper explains a concept that's represented by a word or term. This is based on the author's own ideas or experiences regarding the term. Okay? We actually have two types of definition, denudation and connotation. We have examples. Insider trading, for example, is defined based on dictionary, commonly accepted ideas, or even legal definitions. On the other hand, the word home may be defined based on the writer's experiences, feelings, or associations, or connotation. So what for you is a home? What for you is a friend? What for you is love? You can define that in a definition paper. On the other hand, some terms like insider trading, they cannot be defined with connotation. I'm sure you have experienced some students, you ask them something to define something and they answer, sir, for me, in that situation, I tell them, I'm not asking what it is for you, I'm asking you what it is. For example, when I ask my students, what is plagiarism? And somebody stands up and says, sir, for me, plagiarism is, I'm not asking you about what you feel about plagiarism. Okay? There are terms that we cannot define based on our subjective experiences, like insider trading. There are clear-cut laws, clear-cut definitions of what insider trading is. That's mainly on denudation. All words have denudation, but only a few, not all words have connotation. And one of them, for example, is a home. Okay? You have a connotation. Connotation refers to the subjective feelings, ideas, or associations you have toward a particular concept as represented by a word. Okay? Note that a definition essay is only for the connotation of a word. If you intend to write about the denotative, commonly accepted, or legal definition of a word or term, such as plagiarism or insider trading, Then the mode of development you must use is illustration, not definition. Okay? So let's talk about writing a definition essay. The thesis sentence of a definition paper states the author's own definition of a word or term based on his or her subjective connotation. What is home? What is friend? What is love? And we have a sample thesis sentence for a definition. A home is a place where a person or group of persons can harmoniously live and be themselves, acting their natural self without condemnation of others. That's my that's my own thesis sentence about what a home is. Okay. Um, do you hear the washing machine? There's a washing machine in my house right now. Can you hear it?
It's okay, Sir Andy. Just speak a little louder.
Okay, just let me speak a little louder. The introductory paragraph of a definition paper gives the denotative definition of a word or term. You give first the denotative definition. It then provides the author's own connotative definition. Okay? We have a definition paper example. Claro and Recto, the eminent national statesman, wrote a definition of nationalism. Okay, here's the definition of nationalism by Claro and Recto. Okay. I do not use nationalism in its narrow partisan sense, but in its whole scope. Nationalism as the love and devotion to all that is ours, to all that is of this land, which was the land of our forefathers and will still be, if we are vigilant, the land of our children and our children's children. Let me go back to our slide. Okay, the body is composed of several paragraphs that explain the uniqueness of an author's definition based on the author's experiences, preferences, and associations. Let me admit both a few people who are trying to come in. Okay, the body is composed of several paragraphs that explain the uniqueness of an author's definition based on the author's experiences, preferences, and associations. Okay, here's an explanation of the uniqueness of our nationalism by Claro and Recto. It is evident that our brand of nationalism is different from that of our accusers. We have no desire and we have never attempted to deny the national self-interest of others in their own countries. We merely want to defend our own, in our own territory. We are nationalists, but we can live in harmony with other nationalists, because all nationalisms can work out a plan for coexistence which will not detract from the sovereignty of any one nation. Okay, so at the start, Claro M. Recto gave his own definition of nationalism, and then he developed it further by differentiating it from other kinds of nationalism. Okay, so he talked about the uniqueness of our nationalism. For the conclusion part, the conclusion reinforces the difference between the denotation of the word or term and that of the author's own connotation. So it's just a restatement of the thesis sentence. Let's now deal with classification. The classification essay categorizes kinds of an item based on shared characteristics. So, kinds of houses, kinds of dolls, kinds of toys. If you discuss them, you are to use a classification essay. Now, essential to a classification mode of development are, number one, the basis for classification, the categories formed based on the basis for classification. So how do we write a classification essay? We have the thesis sentence. The thesis sentence discusses the basis for classification and the categories formed based on that basis for classification. Again, it contains the basis and the categories.
Sir Andy. Hello, Sir
Yes,
Andy.
yes.
There's an information here that the background is a little noisy. So can we speak a little louder na lang po to drown out the background?
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay.
Opo, okay, thank you
Better
very
now.
much. The thesis sentence discusses the basis for classification and the categories formed based on that basis for classification. We have a thesis sentence example. Here's an example of a thesis sentence for classification. The different kinds of chocolates based on composition are dark chocolate, white chocolate, and milk chocolate. So first, the sentence gives the basis for classification, and that is composition. The thesis sentence goes on to discuss the different kinds of categories that were created based on that basis. So dark chocolate, white chocolate, milk chocolate. Okay? So let's talk about the introductory part of the classification. The introductory paragraph provides some background regarding the classification. It contains the thesis sentence as well. The body is composed of several paragraphs that describe the shared characteristics in each category. So if you are to write a classification paper based on chocolate and the different kinds of chocolates based on composition, then you would devote one or more paragraphs about dark chocolate, one or more paragraphs about white chocolate, and one or more paragraphs about milk chocolate. We have a classification example. This is a classic essay about some African birds. Okay, some African birds. This is an excerpt from Out of Africa by Isaac Dinesen. Isaac Dinesen was a Dutch woman. She was a colonialist. She and her husband owned a large tract of land in Africa, and she wrote about the things she had seen in Africa. And later on, it was turned into a movie called Out of Africa. Those of you who are 50 and above, or maybe even like me, you probably got the chance to watch that movie. Okay, but it came from an essay, and we have an excerpt from that essay, and that excerpt is a classification essay. Some African birds. Let me read to you some. Let me read to you some paragraphs that discuss a particular category of birds. Okay, for example, the storks. This paragraph talks about the storks. Let me read this to you. We had the black and white storks in Africa, the birds that build their nests upon the thatched village roofs of northern Europe. They look less imposing in Africa than they do there. For here, they had such tall and ponderous birds as the marabout and the secretary bird to be compared to. The storks have got other habits in Africa than in Europe, where they live as in married couples and are symbols of domestic happiness. Here they are seen together in big flights as in clubs. They are called locust birds in Africa and follow along when the locusts come upon the land, living high on them. They fly over the plain too, where there is a grass fire go on, circling just in front of the advancing line of small leaping flames, high up in the scintillating rainbow-colored air, and the gray smoke, on watch for the mice and snakes that ran from the fire. The storks have a gay time in Africa, but their real life is not here. And when the winds of spring bring back thoughts of mating and nesting, their hearts are turned toward the north. They remember old times and places and fly off two and are shortly after waiting in the cold bogs of their birthplaces. So bumabalik sila sa Europe. She also discussed the crested cranes. The crested cranes which come on to the newly rolled and planted maize land to steal the maize out of the ground make up for the robbery by being birds of good omen, announcing the rain, and also by dancing to us. When the tall birds are together in large numbers, it is a fine sight to see them spread their wings and dance. There is much style in the dance and little affectation. For why, when they can fly, do they jump up and down as if they were held onto the earth by magnetism? The whole ballet has a sacred look, like some ritual dance. Perhaps the cranes are making an attempt to join heaven and earth like the winged angels walking up and down Jacob's ladder. With their delicate pale gray coloring, the little black velvet skull cap and fan-shaped crown, the cranes have all the air of light-spirited frescoes. When, after the dance, they lift and go away to keep up the sacred tone of the show they give out, by the wings or the voice, a clear ringing note as if a group of church bells had taken to the wing and were sailing off. You can hear them a long way away, even after the birds themselves have become invisible in the sky, a chime from the clouds. So, each paragraph talks about a particular category. Okay? So, for the conclusion part, the conclusion includes a restatement of the thesis sentence or main ideas. Okay, for the classification. So, usually note that conclusions tend to be merely a restatement of the thesis sentence.